Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're studying the Thessalonian correspondence, and we're continuing our introduction of Second Thessalonians by taking a little time to talk about the man of lawlessness and who he might be, and the identity of the man of lawlessness. We've talked throughout the Thessalonian correspondence about the evidence we have from both letters of the just the primary place Paul placed on teaching about the second coming. But we see this in his preaching. We see it clearly in when he preaches on the Areopagus, Mars Hill, in Acts chapter 17. I mean, that's where they shut his sermon down and start to and interrupt him when he starts talking about the second coming and the resurrection of the dead. And he's written these letters to clarify things. Let me say a couple of things about the eschatology, which makes up the bulk of Second Thessalonians. We don't often think of Second Thessalonians as an eschatological work the way we think of Daniel, the second half of Daniel, or the book of Revelation, but it is. It's very much in an eschatological genre, and eschatology was a well-known genre, especially among Jews, but really a well-known genre of literature in its day, and it had its conventions. And so when you're talking about the end of something, and eschatology doesn't always talk about the end of time, not even in the Bible. Sometimes eschatological language in the Bible talks about the fall of the Roman Empire or the end of the Babylonian Empire, or maybe it's the coming of the Messiah. It is the end of an era. But here he's clearly talking about the end of time. So we are talking about the end of time. And he's describing some things that have to happen, that are going to happen before the end of time. Now, let's always remember that we don't know how long before. As I said, when we're talking about First Thessalonians, I seriously doubt that it entered into Paul's imagination that we would be here 2,000 years later. He may or may not be around for the second coming, but I'm sure he didn't think it was going to be thousands of years later, and we'd still be here talking about the letters that he had written. And so he talks about certain things that are going to take place before, but we don't know how long before. If he's describing something that will be happening by the end of the first century, or start to happen by the end of the first century, I'm sure that in his mind and in theirs, it's happening immediately before the second coming, but they don't know that for sure, and we don't know it for sure either, so let's remember that. Let's talk about this individual character, the man of lawlessness, the son of perdition. And let's not forget that Jesus uses the phrase son of perdition to describe Judas in John chapter 17, verse 12. And John's gospel, of course, being written many decades after the Thessalonian correspondence. And so it's not a phrase that is borrowed from John. It's a phrase that John may have borrowed from Paul. But let's not forget that Judas is called the son of perdition. There are a lot of possibilities as to who this person might be. Let's remind ourselves, now that we're talking about John and his writings, that in 1 John and 2 John, John talks about antichrists, plural, and never identifies a single person as the Antichrist. There are only antichrists and an Antichrist. And so the Bible does not ever identify one single enemy of the gospel in a final showdown that's going to turn into a pitched battle. That good will finally triumph over evil. In the book of Revelation, there are witnesses and images and metaphors that seem to be representing individuals or to represent roles that individuals might play, like maybe the papacy or the emperor, or several corrupt institutions and their representatives in those early years, those early centuries of church history. And that may be what's happening here, that this person represents not just one individual person, but represents a corrupt pope or many corrupt popes, or a corrupt, which seems to be more likely to me, a corrupt emperor, or many corrupt, or all the emperors who are pagan and who persecute the church. And so that could easily be the person that he is thinking about. The man of lawlessness might be the devil himself. It might be false teachers as a class of people, as a group of people who are personified in one person. We've talked in the past about the characteristics of apocalyptic as a genre of literature, that like any genre of literature, apocalyptic has its conventions. In Westerns, you have shootouts, you have horses, you have wide open spaces, you have white hats and black hats, or maybe you don't know what color the hat is, but whether you're reading Zane Grey or Cormac McCarthy, there are inside the genre certain conventions, as there are in any genre, whether it's romantic comedy or sci-fi or fantasy. Each genre has its conventions, as does apocalyptic. The moon is going to turn to blood. The stars are going to fall from the sky. And there are going to be these extreme examples. And one convention in Jewish apocalyptic that we haven't mentioned in our study is that the enemy, whether the enemy is Rome, whether the enemy is, generally in the first century, the enemy is Rome, or whether the enemy is something else or some other influence, Jews who accommodate the Roman culture, for instance, in the apocalyptic of the Essenes, the enemy, whether that enemy is a nation or a movement, is always personified by an individual person. There's always one monster out there with a face and a presence and a name. But that monster doesn't represent an individual that you can name, but a force, whether it's the Roman Empire or the Sadduceic movement, the Herodian movement. It's always representing a force. So I think we need to be very careful at trying to assign a name, a historical name, to the man of lawlessness that we're going to be reading about in 2 Thessalonians. If there is a name we can attach, I think there are two candidates that they have to be. It has to be one of these, if it is an individual at all. And it could just be the devil. A lot of commentators think that the man of lawlessness is the man who has opposed us since the garden. The serpent of old that Revelation will talk about. I think if there's someone else, it would be Nero. Nero was he as messed up as Caligula? No. But was he more catastrophic in terms of persecution for the church? Absolutely he was. Nero was the person who didn't care about anyone but himself. Nero was the person who burnt down the city of Rome. Nero was the person who blamed that on Christians, who identified Christians as enemies of the state, who burnt Christians alive after he had covered them in pitch, who threw Christians to the wild beasts as public entertainment. Nero is the person looming large in their immediate history within a decade or so, within 2 decades easily, that is going to bring, persecution they cannot imagine yet on their heads. Just not forget that while Paul was in Macedonia, his citizenship protected him. That's not going to happen anymore. We're going to look at the intro tomorrow, verses 1 through 4 of chapter 1. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 10 minutes with the Word.